industry representatives, or they are, unfortunately, government representatives dealing with those agencies that don't want to really face the problem, and all they want to do is come out and placate us. So most of us have a very, very negative attitude about science. I've heard many people say, you know, science is bad. Science is our enemy. Science is not our enemy. And it is with great pleasure that I am able to introduce to you the keynote speakers, 2 women. We can be very proud of that. Scientists, real scientists. One who's been more in the laboratory, the theoretical kind of scientist, one the more practical scientist, the physician, each working in their own ways, being real scientists, following prescribed scientific methodology. And what's really important here is that these women who began to get these strange results, and they're out there in a field of people who are very, very skeptical. They had the courage of their convictions to stand up and say, look, we've got a real problem here. It's more than just women's own hormones causing problems. We're seeing things that mankind, I guess I should say, has put out there in the environment that is mimicking the hormones that we naturally produce. It took a lot of courage to do that, and they've still been met with a lot of skepticism. There's a lot of people out there saying they're all wet, but they're keeping on saying it. They're keeping on with their studies. And so it is with really great pride that I'm going to present to you simultaneously both of our speakers, Dr. Devralee Davis, who incidentally has just received a presidential appointment to the National Chemical Safety Board. She's already been confirmed by the Senate. And Dr. Anna Soto, who is a physician and a professor of cell biology at Tufts University. And in that order, they're going to come and talk to you about some of their findings. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Buenos dias. I am delighted to be here, and I want to commend the organizers for the job they did in getting such a splendid turnout on such a typical, wonderful Saturday morning at this part of the country. I'm from Washington, and we have heat, but we don't have this. I'd like to begin by reading a poem of a colleague who was unable to make this meeting that I think sets the context for what a lot of us are concerned about right now. The title of the poem is, "In response to a promotional ad claiming that the number of people who have survived cancer could now fill the city of Los Angeles." That's the title of the poem. It's a big ad showing a city of Los Angeles with lights and saying that the number of survivors could now fill the city of Los Angeles. And the poem goes, "And the non-survivors fill the Pacific Ocean, the Grand Canyon, and the whole of Antarctica. They fill our silences, and they fill our mouths when we try to speak. They inhabit vast and magnificent cities. The non-survivors remember Los Angeles as just a dot on the map, a stone's throw in the sticks where everybody knew each other's business. Walk along the banks of the Grand Calumet. Walk to Ground Zero, Nevada. Go down to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Point out to folks that no one can sleep in Los Angeles. The breastless, hairless ones always watching at the city gates, howling at the city gates all night. Everybody wants to be an angel." Now, today is the Sabbath for me and for some of us. And I appreciated the beginning with a prayer. We all need to pray for our government, for ourselves, for those who are afflicted with this disease. And I thought I'd begin with a little parable of two men who were squabbling. They came to the rabbi. They said, "We both own this piece of land." And the rabbi said, "Wait a second. let's ask the land to whom it belongs. So they said, all right. The rabbi listened and he said, well, the land says it belongs to neither of you. You belong to it. In fact, that's an appropriate parable for what we have to do today. We have to reclaim the ways in which we belong to the land and our responsibilities as citizens. These are difficult times for us all. Those of us who are concerned with breast cancer are often asked, what's going on with all of these women now? I mean, has breast cancer really changed all that much? And the true answer is breast cancer has not changed all that much. It has always been the most common cancer in women in industrial countries for the past 20 or 30 years. It is more common than lung cancer, but more women die of lung cancer because smoking causes a much more fatal disease. But in fact, women have changed, and that's what this meeting and a lot of the other activities are all about. There are more women in Congress. There are more women in the Senate. We even have 2 women on the Supreme Court. Only 7 more to go. And now I'll begin with my first slide. And I'm going to talk with you today about the science of breast cancer. And I want to make something clear. I am speaking to you as a scientist, and I'm going to give you a description of the scientific evidence, which is the grounds for thinking that there are some causes of breast cancer that are due to the environment. This does not mean that all of breast cancer is due to the environment, but it means that there is some portion of breast cancer out there we can do something about. And I'm going to review that scientific evidence with you, and then at the conclusion, I'm going to share with you the question of how much evidence do we have, and do we have enough proof to take action? In fact, there are several different paths to breast cancer, as indicated on this slide. Now, can you hear me? Yeah. All right. And is this a recording mic? So I'll move it this way. I prefer to. Hormones have been widely discussed in the media as linked to breast cancer. Gene structure refers to the very basic architecture of DNA, the building in which your cell's basic genetic information lives. And gene structure can be damaged by environmental exposures, that we know. In addition, gene function can be damaged as well. Think of it as though you have a gutter on your roof and you have a very heavy downpour. The gutter is there, the structure is intact, but if the gutter is weak in some way, it will not function to do its job, and you may get flooding in your basement or in your walls, something that I suspect happens here from time to time.
Yes.
Now, what we know about the risk factors for breast cancer are these. The earlier in life a woman gets her period, the more estrogen she'll be exposed to throughout her lifetime. The later in life she goes through the change of life, the more estrogen she'll be exposed to in her lifetime. If she is obese after menopause, she will have more estrogen exposure. The reason for this is that fat itself produces estrogen, and menopause means that the ovaries are shutting down their production of estrogen. But if you are heavier after menopause, you will have a higher level of estrogen. If you've had no children, if you have not nursed your children, or if you drink 2 drinks a day, all of these things have been shown to increase the amount of estrogen that you produce in your body. In addition, we know that repeated fluoroscopic x-rays, which were done to women in the 40s and 50s when they would drive trucks around to screen for tuberculosis. Does anyone here remember getting those screens? And repeated exams of school teachers with high doses have been linked to an increase in breast cancer. And radiation during adolescence is clearly a risk factor. We know from the studies of the women of Hiroshima, on whom they had the atom bomb exposure. If you have had a history of breast cancer, and if you are 65 or older, you have a very high risk of breast cancer. Now, what we can say about these risk factors is that most of them are linked to your total lifetime exposure to bioavailable estradiol. The more estradiol you've been exposed to, the greater your risk of breast cancer. Now, together with colleagues in a number of medical centers, we have developed a theory, and it is a theory, that xenoestrogens, which means foreign estrogens, things you are exposed to in the environment, influence the amount of estrogen that your body will make over your lifetime. Some of these are organochlorine pesticides. Some appear to be plastics. And Dr. Soto has pioneered in some innovative test systems to determine whether or not chemicals appear to increase estrogen production. She will be talking to you further about those. Suffice it to say that we know from experimental studies that a number of environmental chemicals can boost the body's own production of estrogen. And what we know about the causes of breast cancer, as the mayor's representative made quite clear, is that only about 30% of the cases have known risk factors. At most 10% have inherited a defective gene. This means that 9 out of 10 women who get breast cancer were born with healthy genes. Something happened to them in their lifetime. Something happened to the women, is this better? Who were born with healthy genes to cause them to get breast cancer, since 9 out of 10 women who get the disease inherited healthy genes. Now, what we know about the biology of the breast is indicated in this slide from Dr. Susan Love's book. Most breast tumors occur in the upper portion of the breast, in the fatty portion of the breast, and are thought to arise and a result of uncontrolled cell growth. That's in fact what breast cancer is. The estrogen receptor can be affected at different stages in a woman's life, unfortunately including prenatally. We know that prenatal exposures can be important because women who are toxemic during pregnancy, which can be a complication, will have lower levels of estrogen, and their daughters have less of a risk of breast cancer than women, for example, who have twins. Twins will have a higher risk of breast cancer because the twin mother has more of everything, including estrogen, and that may be why their children later on have a higher risk. We know that girls who were irradiated during Hiroshima have a greater risk of developing breast cancer than women who are irradiated later in life. And we know that women who are in menopause have a higher risk if they have higher body fat, and it appears they're at a higher risk if they've had more exposure to organochlorines. Now, about the estrogen receptor, we think of it as somewhat like a lock that, into which a key can fit. The key can turn on the receptor, or it can bind with the receptor and not necessarily turn it on. There are good and bad xenoestrogens. This is a very important concept to make clear. Some xenoestrogens, such as those in soy products, appear to be beneficial. Others, such as those in some pesticides, appear to be harmful. In fact, you can see here how complicated it gets. Some of the body's natural estrogen can turn on the estrogen receptor and cause more cell proliferation. And it will bind up a certain amount of the circulating estradiol. If estradiol is bound up, if it's bound up like this, it can't circulate through the blood and get into the nucleus where it can cause damage. If it is free and unbound, then it has the possibility of causing more proliferation. In the case of the good xenoestrogens shown on the right side here, they may bind to the receptor, but in fact not cause an increase in breast cell growth, because they will provide good scavenger molecules that will go in there like Pac-Man and chew up all the bad stuff. And these antioxidants can work to reduce the body's burden of harmful materials that cause damage. And again, these can be the good xenoestrogens, such as those that are in some plant materials, as opposed to the bad ones that will cause more cell proliferation. So in fact, it's an interesting and complicated picture we have to weave. If one looks at the evidence on the good and the bad estrogen, that fancy thing up there is the name of an estrogen metabolite that appears to be particularly bad. And what we know is if you compare breast cancer tissue from people who've had breast cancer with tissue from women who've had reductions in their breasts for surgical reasons that did not have breast cancer, and you grow this tissue in a petri dish, after a number of days you can count the amount of the bad estrogen and the good estrogen. And what you find is that women who have breast cancer have 5 times higher level of this bad estrogen compared to the good estrogen. when you compare them to women who do not have breast cancer. Interestingly, if we look at mice strains that we breed in the laboratory to make them have breast cancer, they also have much, much higher levels of the bad estrogen compared to the good estrogen. So we have now embarked on a series of studies with colleagues at Cornell University to look at materials that affect the production of good and bad estrogen. Interestingly, Asian women have much lower levels. And it occurs to me that part of the problem with the studies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki could be that we may be underestimating the risk of radiation in that population because those people have always had high exposures to genistein and soy, which we know are antioxidants and will reduce the risk of cancer overall. What we have found from a series of studies that have been done by colleagues at Seattle and New York and Los Angeles and Tokyo is that if you compare breast cancer patients to healthy women who've had breast surgery, so you have a part of their breast to look at, you find that there's increased damage to their DNA. That basically the basic building block of all cells of DNA of someone with breast cancer looks different from that same fundamental genetic material from women who are healthy. And that's a very important clue. It may, in fact, lead us to develop a screening test that we could use to identify women who've had genetic damage and find them before they get breast cancer. Because we all know that mammography is not prevention. It's important for older women to get mammograms, but it doesn't prevent breast cancer. It picks up the disease 7 to 8 years after it's developed. What we need to do is come up with a blood or urine test to identify women well before they get the disease so that we can intervene and prevent them from ever experiencing it. And in that regard, the ratio of the good to the bad estrogen, indicated there by this section, that ratio may prove to be very useful for such a test because that can be determined just in a simple urine test. Now, I'm very briefly going to mention the types of evidence that we have available to think that there is any connection between breast cancer and the environment. I'm going to do this very briefly. Dr. Soto will comment on it as well. If you look here, the nice box in the margins that are indicated there is intended to convey the fact that in experimental studies, we have very clear information and boundaries. We can tell you the genetic history of those animals. We know a lot about them. And there are questions raised about the relevance of those studies to humans because those animals are so different from us in some interesting ways. If you look at the wildlife studies, that's a little trickier. These animals get viruses, they have normal population variations. Anyone who's tried to fish in a pond from one year to the next, even without pesticides, knows that there's a lot of things that go on that keep that fish from getting on your hook. Human studies, and you'll note that the people are blue, and all mixed together, are the most difficult thing on which we can ever try to get good data. And you will hear the comment made that we are uncertain about human data. And that is in fact true. We are always uncertain about human data. And that is inherent in the nature of the evidence because we don't put people in those cages and we don't know their genetic histories and we don't control what they eat. And as a consequence, we will always have debates about the meaning of human data. Now I'm going to very rapidly go through some of the animals that have been shown to have profound effects. Male fish are not supposed to have yolk sacs. It would be like a man being born with an ovary. And male fish are showing up with yolk sacs. Turtles, their sex can be determined by what you paint on the eggshell at a critical time. If you paint the turtle eggs at the wrong time, you can make them all female. And that's a big problem if you're trying to be reproducing as a species. The same thing with snails. And in fact, the alligators of Lake Apopka, a very brave colleague of ours has in fact determined that they have small penises. And this may sound like something that's humorous, but in fact it's a tragedy for the species and of great serious implications for all of us. The Florida panther has been found to have a number of abnormalities with its genital tract, the male panther in particular. Now they cannot reproduce for a lot of reasons, including the fact that their normal breeding range is quite large, but one of the contributors to the problems with the Florida panther is believed to be exposure to xenoestrogenic materials in the environment. Interesting study was done comparing military dogs that served in Vietnam with dogs that served elsewhere in the military. And it was found that the dogs that served in Vietnam had 2 to 3 times the rate of testicular cancer and lowered sperm counts. Now, we don't know the exact exposures those dogs had, but there was something about that experience that increased their risk of these diseases. Now, the real interesting question that arises here is, what does this mean for human beings? After all, these are wildlife. Lots of things happen to them. It appears that there may be a drop in sperm count. This has been widely reported. Now, there are legitimate questions about the validity of these measures of sperm count drop. For example, when you're looking at people who go to a fertility clinic, they're going to a clinic because they have a problem. They may not represent the right population. But even saying that, in the past month, the Danish government released a report, and the next 2 months, the British government and the German government will be releasing reports, and they will all say the same thing, namely, the male is endangered. There appears to be a worldwide increase in testicular cancer. These are reports from the British, the German, and the Danish government. Testicular cancer has doubled in every industrial country, excepting perhaps Finland, since 1970. Sperm counts appear to have dropped, and abnormalities of the male genital tract appear to have increased. Ectopic pregnancies in women have increased, but no one in the government is yet issuing a report about the endangered female. However, there is more surgery in baby boys for undescended testes, and there appears to be an increase in breast cancer in men. And a breast cancer in a man is an extremely rare event and should be regarded as a very serious indication of a potential problem. Now, the last thing I will leave you with briefly is the studies on humans. Remember I told you they're the most difficult thing to do for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. This describes and summarizes all of the most recent studies that have looked at women with breast cancer and looked at them to see what is the risk of breast cancer if you have a higher level of organochlorines. This indicates that in this study, if you have a higher level of exposure to organochlorines, you have 2.5 times the risk of breast cancer than if you have the lowest level exposure. And you will notice that all of those studies look very similar, except for one, the Krieger 1994 study, where there is no excess risk. But that study included 50 Asian women, 50 blacks, and 50 whites. Remember, there's something protective about being Asian. We don't know what it is. It could be the diet, the natural xenoestrogens that are good for you in that diet. Now, I'd like to have the slides off for a second and leave you with this question. Do we have proof that breast cancer is caused by the environment? Well, it depends, like a lot of things. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And on this issue, I would remind you of the paradigm of lung cancer and smoking. How long did we wait before we, as society, took action against smoking? In the 1940s and 50s, the United States government handed out cigarettes to GIs in foxholes. This was thought to help calm their nerves. You can imagine what it must have felt like to be sitting around in a foxhole. And at that time, there were health scientists who warned, this is dangerous, nicotine is addictive, and it doesn't appear to be good for you. But we waited, the British government first, and then we, to take action until more than 50 studies had accumulated in 20 different countries, all showing that smoking was related to lung cancer and other diseases. The situation we face now is that we do not have 50 studies in 20 countries. We have some very compelling experimental evidence, which I've shown you, and some pioneering work that Dr. Soto will show you, and there are legitimate questions that can be raised about the uncertainty. In this debate, uncertainty is often discovered somewhat like the cross was used to the vampire. We are uncertain. We had better wait. And that is a legitimate scientific position up to a point. The decision of how much evidence should be taken is not a scientific decision. The decision of how much action is required is not a scientific decision. That is a political decision. And I leave it to you and your colleagues, the mayor's office, and all of those who are concerned about this issue to help us figure out what the right thing is to do. Thank you very much. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Soto, who has done some very important work developing some of the test systems that indicate the possibility that chemicals have estrogenic activity. And I will move my backpack out of your way.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm grateful to the Women for Health and the Environment for organizing this very needed conference and for inviting me to share my work and ideas with this audience. I must say it's very challenging to share the podium with Dr. Davis. She's such a compelling speaker. You're blessed here. So, I will try not to repeat what she's saying, and instead of concentrating on the human aspect, that is the epidemiology, the victim of these xenoestrogens, we are going to try to concentrate on the causal agents. And again, we do not know if those are the causal agents. This is a hypothesis, and we are trying to eventually test it. Do you hear me? No. Oh. So something is going on here.
Maybe we can lower it. How's that? That's looking good.
I'll go get somebody. Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you need to get closer.
Should I try? Do you hear me now? Okay. So what I said is that I'm not going to repeat what Dr. Devralee said. She concentrated on people that suffer cancer. I'm going to concentrate on hormone mimics that are present in the environment and that we hypothesize may be the causal factor for the increase in the pathologies that Dr. Davis summarized a few minutes ago. May I have the first slide, please? I first want to acknowledge that what I'm going to talk about was the work of a team, actually two teams. It was done at Tufts University in partnership with my colleague, Dr. Carlos Sonnenschein, and Marieta Fernandez, and in the University of Granada, Spain, with my colleagues Fatima Nicolia and Maria Dolores Rouge. And next slide, please. Our story starts about 75 years ago with the chemical revolution, maybe even 100 years ago. Progress in chemistry resulted in very useful products, and also in the production of toxic waste that was released into the environment, thinking that it would dilute to nothingness in the water and atmosphere. So right there, we had a wrong hypothesis. We or our predecessors thought that it was going to dilute to nothingness. Next slide, please. Now, one problem is the byproducts. The other problem is that the products that we synthesize that would have so many good uses also have biological properties that were totally unforeseen by the people that synthesized them. And so they affected the health of people and animals. And in addition to that, these compounds, in order to be effective, were created in a way that they are long-lasting. So therefore, they remain in soil, water, air, and accumulate also in the tissues of living organisms. So yes, they are released in great quantities when they dilute in water, the concentrations are very small, but when animals drink that water, then these chemicals will concentrate in the animals. So the property, as I said, of these chemicals is that they are long-lived, they are fat-loving, they are very insoluble in water, and they bioaccumulate and biomagnify, and that is illustrated in the next slide. Well, this is first the chemicals that we know have been produced intentionally. They are mostly pesticides like DDT, Delrin, Toxaphene, and Lindane, and some other chemicals were released, and they are just indirectly, unintentionally, like dioxins, furans, and PCBs. Now, when I say that it was part of the deal to make compounds that last very long, because you see, we knew from the beginning that DDT lasts long. It says its killing power endures. Okay, so that was known. Now, of course, yeah, but that was the advertising, and of course the intention was that it's a good insecticide, right? And it's true, it's a good insecticide. The problem is what the unintended effects. So here we have the bald eagle that was on the verge of extinction thanks to DDT, precisely. So what we are seeing here is that from water to through the food web, we will see this bioaccumulation of xenoestrogens, and from one that we would say is the relative concentration in water, we get to the herring gull, where it has concentrated 25 million times. So there resides one of the most important problems. Now, those compounds, the ones that interest me, are called endocrine disruptors. And those are chemicals that alter the normal functions of the organism by imitating hormones, and also by blocking hormone action. And that happens both during the development and of individuals as well as during adulthood. Estrogens, that are the hormones that are most relevant to breast cancer, are necessary for growth and maturation of the female reproductive organs, oviduct, uterus, vagina, and also the breast, and are of course very important for pregnancy. So yes, estrogens are good, but estrogens are also a risk factor for breast cancer. Now, as I said, the bald eagle was probably the first sign that something was wrong in the environment. And since then, we have seen many other things going on. Most species, be birds, mammals, or fish, have shown signs of decreased reproductive success, feminization of males, demasculinization of males, problems in the thyroid tumors in fish, wasting syndrome, animals that as soon as they hatch, they die, immunosuppression, and neurotoxicity. So this is just one example, birds that are very sick, and some of them have birth defects, like this one has a cross beak and of course cannot eat. And most of those animals with cross beaks are also females. Then, as Dr. Davis mentioned, is the very nice work by Dr. Lou Gillette that shows that alligators in Lake Apopka that had been exposed to the pesticide kelthane that contains DDE have signs of demasculinization and feminization. And those animals, we do not know whether they will reproduce or not because they are young, but we know that they have shortened penises and they don't produce enough testosterone, and their testes look feminized. So we know that they are in trouble already. So with all this information from wildlife, in 1991, Theo Colborn convened a group of scientists at Windspread, and we produced, after looking over all the data that we had at that moment, we produced what we call the Windspread Statement, and where we declare that we are certain that a large number of man-made chemicals in the environment have the potential to disrupt the endocrine system of animals, including humans. And that was before the study in Denmark that showed that the sperm count in humans was going down. So, in a way, wildlife was the harbinger of what was going on with humans, just because our life cycle is longer in general. The first study on sperm count was published in 1992, and it has been reproduced since, so we know that now those reproductive effects are being seen in humans. The difference that we have, however, between the two cases is that where in wildlife we can, in certain instances, identify the culprit and say this product has been the cause of this decrease in reproductive rate. In humans, we haven't done that yet, and so I will explain in a few moments why is that we think that the best hypothesis, that of course is not proven yet, is that estrogens are the only possible factor that will connect together all the reproductive effects that we are seeing. So again, this is a hypothesis. Now, some other estrogens were used for treatment of patients like DS, and we also learned from there, and we learned that DS administered during pregnancy produce major changes in the genital tract, and that those changes are perceived functionally after puberty. In other words, that when we administer estrogens to pregnant women, things happen in the fetus that you won't see in the newborn, who will have perfectly, apparently healthy newborns, and then in adulthood, problems of the reproductive tract will start to appear. So one of the things that we hypothesize at Windspread is that this may also be present after exposure to xenoestrogens, that is, to environmental chemicals. And what we know from animal studies is that exposure during development in males may produce effects that, as a consequence, would reduce the sperm count. For example, a reduced number of Sertoli cells in the testes will bring about a lowering of the sperm count during adulthood. And also, because of the DS data, we know that genital tract defects will be produced in males. In females, we know that clear cell carcinoma of the vagina is one of the consequences of exposure to DS. And we do not know yet whether or not an increase in breast cancer would occur, because this generation was first treated in 1950s. So it's coming to the age in which breast cancer incidence starts to increase. In a few years, we will know. Now, estrogenic compounds also have effects in adult humans. And actually, in 1949, male workers that were crop dusters, aviation crop dusters, complained of impotence. And when they were examined, they were found to have very low sperm counts. Okay, so DDT already in 1949 produced these effects. Ketone, in the 60s, factory workers that were packing ketone, a pesticide that is estrogenic, also underwent impotence and low sperm counts. And we know that female breast development can also occur when adult males are exposed to estrogens. In females, we know that exposure to estrogens may result in early breast development, and like the telarc epidemic in Puerto Rico, that we do not know the cause, but little girls are showing breast development. And for the time being, estrogens are the main risk factor for breast cancer. Now, if we look at the chronological table here, we realize that PCBs, some of them are estrogens, were introduced in 1929. DDT was manufactured in 38. And this, by the way, is a slide by Theo Colborn. So if we look at the 40s, that is the first generation that was exposed to man-made chemicals, okay? Then in the 40s and 50s, we have, of course, the generation that is exposed postnatally. Between the 50s and the 70s, the ones that were exposed in utero. And now we are getting the first generation of people that were children of the first generation that was exposed in utero. And we do not know what the results of this may be, but we should take that in consideration, this chronology, when we think of the increased incidence of breast cancer, testicular cancer, undescended testes, defects of the urinary tract in males, etc., all pathology that seems to have increased somewhere between 1950s and today. Now, if we go back to breast cancer, just to remind you of what Debra said a few minutes ago, maybe 5% can be attributed to genetic causes. 95%, I assume it's environmental or so, or if not environmental, is due to our own estrogens. We know that our own estrogens are a very important risk factor. So that is why we are so interested in estrogens, because they are the main risk factor for breast cancer. Now, as it was mentioned many times during this conference, we have a threefold increase in the incidence of breast cancer. What may have changed in those 50 years? I don't think it's going to be our endogenous production of estrogens. Although it's known that from the beginning of the century to now, women start having their menarche, their first period, earlier. But that happened a long time ago, if we think of it. And also that, so it doesn't seem to be an increase in our own estrogens, but probably something that comes from the environment. And I say probably. So we decided to start looking for those estrogens. I mean, if it comes from the environment, where are they? Okay, so what we did, by the way, I should say that for the last 20 years, I, in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Sonnenschein, have been studying mechanisms by which estrogens make breast cells proliferate. And each one of us has a theory. We do not have the full picture of why estrogens and how estrogens induce cell proliferation. So basic science comes along very slowly. It's very important to get there, but I think that we should do some other things, like, for example, this type of experiment to at least determine which are the environmental estrogens that are out there, so that now we can study what the links are. So we developed an assay that we call the E-screen assay that measures precisely the ability of compounds to mimic estrogens. In so doing, we tested over 70 chemicals that are released into the environment in large quantities. And in summary, we can say that besides, we have several groups. Insecticides, DDT and metabolites were known to be estrogenic. Methoxychlor was known, and ketone was known already before we developed our assay. But using this assay, we found that deldrin, toxaphene, and endosulfane were estrogenic as well. By the way, those are data collected during the last 5 years. So you see that we doubled the insecticides. And then industrial chemicals, we found that antioxidants like alkyl phenols and butyl hydroxyanisole are estrogens, and plasticizers like benzyl butyl phthalate, diphenyl phthalate, and bisphenol A. Bisphenol A, by the way, was not ours, but Dr. Feldman's in California, the first person who discovered that they are estrogens. So just to go over this, to give you an idea about how frequently those compounds are found out there, I should say that nonyl phenol is used in plastics and is also used to prevent the polymerization of hydrocarbons in gas oil. So in every gas station, that is what they use to avoid this problem. Nonyl phenol is also used as a precursor to make detergents that are called nonyl phenol polyethoxylates. They are used in toiletries, lubricants, spermicides like condom lubricants and spermicidal foams, and also in the paper industry as industrial detergents. Now, those alkyl phenol polyethoxylates are not estrogenic per se. In other words, when nonyl phenol is converted into this detergent, the detergent is not an estrogen. However, those compounds are degraded, liberating the estrogen when the refused water gets to a sewage treatment plant. So therefore, it can get into the drinking water that way. And also, there is just a quantity, but you can see that sewage, sometimes sewage sludge can contain lots of nonyl phenol. Now, nonyl phenol was detected in US rivers, and although it's parts per million in water, less than parts per million, it's not totally removed, so it's likely that in some places it would appear in drinking water. Now, bisphenol A, as I said, is also this is a plasticizer and is used in the manufacture of some resins. This is very complex, but just to make it simple, those resins are called polycarbonates, and those resins are used to make containers. For example, if you look at the inside of tin cans, you would see that there is a film of plastic that is put there to avoid that the food itself will attack the metal. 7 or 8 of every 10 cans tested contains a resin that liberates bisphenol A into the contents, okay? So that means that estrogens could be released by the lining of the can into food. In addition, I should say that those bisphenol A resins are used in dentistry, the white fillings, okay, and also some sealants. So that is another source of exposure, and we are writing a paper about that. Now, I'll go to the pesticides. Delrin has been banned in the US, but it's still in our soil because the half-life in soil is 22 years. And it's also present in some fish, okay? And it's used in the third world, so it comes through the atmosphere and it rains in our ecosystem. Practically the same thing can be said about toxaphene, that is also banned in the States. But as you see there, Arctic and Baltic salmon contains lots of it. And in the fat of these animals is enough to make the cells in my assay proliferate. Endosulfan is a pesticide that is used very widely all over the world, and residues of it are present in our fruit and vegetables. And it's known to produce testicular atrophy in animals, which means it's an estrogen. Now, in areas in southern Spain where they do use lots of endosulfan, but we don't have the data that endosulfan is the cause. This is the area where there are lots of intensive agricultural areas. There we have evidence that is anecdotal and is being compiled right now that there are increases of cases of estrogenization of postmenopausal women, that there are an increase of 8-fold of undescended testes, and there are reports of many men that have breast development. But again, we do not know whether or not there is a cause-effect link. What we know is that the fat of certain people here contains very high concentrations of endosulfan. Now, during the last year, our group in Boston and a group in London simultaneously reported that butyl hydroxyanisole, that is an antioxidant approved by FDA to be used in breakfast cereals, potato chips, confections, etc., is an estrogen. And it may be used in lipsticks as well. So we have another source of estrogen there. And then benzyl butyl phthalate is a plasticizer, and it's used as a pesticide dispersant. It's used as a carrier, inert carrier of fragrances, hairsprays. It's also used to make packaging for food, etc. So this is just a summary of the new estrogens, and we haven't checked everything. This is just a list of 70 chemicals. So here comes a question. As more chemicals are identified as estrogens among the chemicals that are already there, how can we estimate the dose that a person receives? I mean, is it fair to determine threshold? How can you determine threshold if you have maybe 10, 20 chemicals that are estrogenic, and they may act cumulatively, so they would add up? So that creates also a scientific problem. I mean, it's so difficult to prove anything at this point. How do you prove this? Or disprove it, for that matter? So one of the things that we decided to do was to develop a method that is quite complicated, but it doesn't matter. That is, go to the blood of people, separate the estrogens produced by the ovary from the estrogens coming from the environment. And we are doing that, and I'm very proud to say that this is funded by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health through the Silent Spring Institute, and the Silent Spring Institute came to birth out of the work of activists of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition that lobby for that money. Now at Silent Spring Institute, we are developing this methodology to measure the total exposure to xenoestrogen in women in areas of Massachusetts where there is higher incidence of breast cancer. So perhaps we may be able to find out whether or not they correlate. The conclusions that I want to bring to your attention are: science is very difficult, it has to be done. We can test chemicals and find out if they are estrogens. But now, once we find out, what do? That is policy, and this is up to the people, I think. It should be up to the people. So we can do that. We can find out which ones are estrogenic, so we can decide what to do with them before they are released. We can take preventive measures, for example. Now, we also have to use methodology, like perhaps this one that we are developing, to assess whether or not the sum of all these xenoestrogens is causing the increase, the excess on breast cancer that we are observing. I think that we should find out. Problem is, when do we act? Do we find out first and then act? Or do we act preventively in prevention now, and then we find out, or while we find out? And that, again, I don't think is a decision for the scientists. It's the people that have to decide what they want. And finally, I would like to say, yes, fine. Things can be tested before they are synthesized even. I mean, companies could contribute to this by testing their compounds and then decide before they release them whether they would not release those that are estrogenic. That could be a very civilized attitude on their part, I think. We can also, citizens could ask for regulation based on that. I don't know whether that will work as much. There is a third option, that is to require that packaging and contents, etc., of food and everything else will reveal the composition of plastics, so people can make an intelligent decision. But I don't know whether that is a sound possibility. And again, I have more questions than answers for you. All I can bring here is method that can be used to tell this is an estrogen. And the other thing that we can bring here is probably a method to determine whether or not xenoestrogens are responsible for the excess on breast cancer. But that is not enough. People, and only people, will make the appropriate decisions. So I pass the ball to your court, and I hope that you would take an enlightened decision. Thank you.
Do we have time for any questions?
I will accept two questions. I will accept two questions from the audience. I see Dr. Sternglass has his hand up. Dr. Sternglass?
I wondered whether you have taken into account the possibility or the evidence that's accumulated over the last 20, 30 years that the presence of fission products from nuclear testing and from nuclear reactors may have had an effect on similar to the kinds of things that you're finding. In particular, there's now growing evidence of in utero effects that, of course, were discovered long ago by Dr. Stewart. And there's now geographic evidence that around areas where large amounts of radioactivity have been discharged, one does find increases in breast cancer and abnormalities of the reproductive system and so on. And I wonder to what extent that your future studies will be taking into account the presence of these substances, many of which can have hormonal effects. For instance, yttrium-90, which is a daughter product of strontium-90, goes to the pituitary glands and all the reproductive glands and can affect the hormonal balance in the human body. And I think I'd be very interested to know how you propose in your future studies to account for these other, factors.
Well, can you tell us the question?
Well, the question is whether or how we are going to test the effect of radiation or radioactives and the incidence of breast cancer. And the answer is, I cannot do everything. I'm only going to concentrate on xenoestrogens, and the methodology that we have measures specifically xenoestrogens. However, if this is going to be done in conjunction with epidemiologists, what we have is an assay, and we have epidemiologists that are aware that radiation is a risk factor. So when we investigate our population, we will know whether they live near a reactor, et cetera, et cetera.
Dr. Davis, do you want to address that?
I think so. Debra?
This is a very tough question. First of all, I want to say that while I have a great deal of respect for you personally, and while I understand that there could be an association between such exposure and elevations, I do not agree with some of your conclusions, right? That is to say that at this point, I don't think the evidence is clear. But I want to say that while the evidence is not clear that nuclear emissions are associated in the United States with patterns of cancer, why should we wait for that evidence before taking the kind of prudent action that needs to be taken to ensure that those emissions don't occur? And in fact, but I think it's very important in the discussion that we stick with what is scientifically defensible. And you would acknowledge, I think, that the kinds of evidence that you're talking about remains speculative. And I would say, even so it's speculative, we still have to take precautionary action. Now, having said that, I think it is important, Dr. Soto and I are focusing chiefly on xenoestrogens. It's important that we all work together on these issues, and there is no denying that worldwide the problems of radiation are dreadful, particularly in Central Europe, where there are many more Chernobyls unfortunately waiting to happen, and where we already have clear evidence of the consequences of that, where there are areas of the former Soviet Union that are uninhabitable for dozens of square miles. Those things are real, and we all know that. And I think, therefore, however, I want to say that I don't support notions that we should not help the Central Europeans to make their plants safer, because there are so many plants there, and I know I'm going to disagree with some of my friends here, but there are so many plants there in states of decay that if we don't make them safer, we'll just have a number of time bombs waiting to go off. Now, ultimately, I would like to see them all eliminated. But in the meantime, we have to make them safer, or there's going to be more emissions of uncontrolled nature, like we just had in India, where they find out first that the cows are dead, and then they figure out that something must have happened to people. So, unfortunately, it's a tough set of issues. And I think that we all have a lot of stuff to do.
Dr. Davis and Dr. Soto have come from a distance, and they have so much expertise here, and they've presented so much really solid information for us that I'm going to relax a bit. And I know we're running behind time, but those of you, if you have questions, they're willing to entertain some more questions. I'll take the limit off of 2. I see a hand right here. This lady, would you please stand up and state your question loudly so everybody can hear it?
I commend the work that the doctors are doing, but Sunday I happened to stumble across a program on cable that talked about surviving cancer. It was approximately about a 2-hour program, and I watched it for about an hour, and it got to be so depressing I had to take myself away from it for a while and then go back to it. What I'd like to know is that they raised some interesting statistics, and that is over the last 40 years, the mortality rate, and I assume they're talking about the 5-year survival rate. The mortality rate has only dropped by 1% in the last 40 years when it comes to addressing cures for cancer. The thing that alarmed me is that most of the monies, 80% of the monies that have been thrown into the cancer research and whatever, has gone to a limited amount of people, and all it has done is increase the number of diagnostic tests, which is something that maybe the e-screen and whatever is not necessarily. What I'd like to know is that should a group like this focus more on maybe prevention versus the fact of dealing with the end product. Yes, we know we're at a point where we're experiencing high rates of cancer. There's not the cure that we expected. The war on cancer, we're not necessarily winning. Should we be focusing on the beginning, education, prevention, and stuff like that?
Well, yes.
I think that my work doesn't have to do at all with diagnosis. What we are talking about is try to prevent. I mean, we are developing methodology that allows, if EPA wants, if FDA wants, if people want, to block the release of chemicals that have hormone activity. That's it. And I think that that is preventive. Now, regarding NIH, it's also up to you people, because yes, there is monies have been traditionally given to concentrate mostly on cures and diagnosis. But I think that the person to talk about that is Devralee, because she criticized the system about 8 years ago. That was the first time I heard about Devralee was in the New York Times Magazine about 7 or 8 years ago. So she described the phenomenon before anybody else was talking about. So, Devralee?
Let me say 2 things. Having had a father who died of multiple myeloma at age 61 and was a machinist, and having had a father who died of multiple myeloma, it may not be something I can say very loudly. I understand the need for treatment. I understand that when people have cancer, they want treatment. Their families want treatment, and they're entitled to get the best compassionate treatment we can offer. I fully understand that. But having said that, I think we have invested far too much in some high technology treatments. Lee Atwater died of brain cancer, And before he died, he had small neutron bomb-like pellets implanted in his brain in a last-ditch attempt to irradiate it in order to shrink his tumor. He was a swollen mass, and no matter what you might have thought of his politics, no one should have to die like that. And unfortunately, a lot of what we have invested in is high-tech treatment. And unfortunately, it's not going to help most people. We know an awful lot about preventing cancer right now. We know there are more than 30 different workplace hazards that clearly increase the risk of cancer in workers who are exposed to them. And with the proposed legislation and budget overhauls now for OSHA, we are not making much progress on that front, unfortunately. We know that certain things that you eat are bad for you. We've done a very good job of telling people what they do to themselves. Don't smoke, don't eat bad foods, don't engage in dangerous sex. But we can't say no to the polluting power plant in our backyards. We can't say no to dirty water. And that's where society has to do a better job of taking the information that we have and using it to try to reduce the cancer burden. Let me be clear about something. The environment, in some big sense, explains all of cancer in that we have not been born with defective genes. But the environment that you can control doesn't refer to your diet, because it's very hard to control your diet. You can't pick your parents. You can't change what you ate 3 decades ago. A lot of the environment contains things you can't change. So if you ask what you can do something about, even though drinking heavily chlorinated surface water for 40 or more years may be a fairly small increase in your risk. You may get 30% more colon cancer and 40% more bladder cancer. That's a small increase, but everybody drinks water. And so we have to work and focus on the things that may be fairly small risks in the big scene, but everybody breathes and everybody drinks water. And those are the things that it's worthwhile to focus on in terms of prevention. But having said that, I want to say to any of you here who are cancer survivors and your families, that research shows that those people who are connected to other people, whether through your church or your synagogue or your support group, will live longer and live better even if they have cancer. And that meetings like this and groups like these serve a very valuable function for everybody's health.
All right, let's take one more question, and please be brief in that question. I see this gentleman right here.
I have a question about a possible interrelationship between dietary fat and the type of fat, whether it's olive oil or saturated fat, and these xenoestrogens.
We've actually done some cell culture studies on that question, and we can show you that olive oil appears to be one of the good estrogens. Olive oil appears to be beneficial. Now, in small amounts. That doesn't mean you should go out and drink a pint of olive oil. First of all, it'd be very expensive. Corn oil, in contrast, does not appear to be so beneficial. Peanut oil and sesame oil and the whole nut oils, which are more expensive, like olive oil, appear to be beneficial. Fish oil also does. Now, I would add something that, in fact, Dr. Soto and I need to talk about, because I was thinking as I was looking at the e-screen results, there are good and bad estrogens from the system that we're working on now. That is to say, soy products appear to be beneficial. But in your assay, soy would be estrogenic. And so would some other naturally occurring plant materials. They would appear to be estrogenic in your system. And some people have used this argument to say, therefore, the plant estrogens are much more important, and we should ignore all these other things. Now, keep this in mind. It is true that these plant materials are estrogenic, but they are excreted rapidly. They are not bound to the steroid binding hormone globulin. They are bound up, and therefore they do not become toxic. In contrast, the organochlorines and the other chemicals that you've looked at do become toxic. So I don't want everyone to leave here thinking that it's clear that you shouldn't eat cereal for example, because in fact cereal contains a lot of good things, fiber and selenium and zinc and manganese, and especially if it's so-called enriched. And what we're talking about here is really at the very frontier. Her assay is pioneering in the ability to screen large numbers of chemicals for this property, but we've got to be very careful in seeing that it's used in a way that doesn't subvert what our intention here is, which is to try to create more of a preventive strategy for public health. Maybe you'd like to comment.
Yeah, plant estrogens are estrogens in our system. I mean, they do everything that an estrogen does. Like if you give it to a rat, the uterus of the rat will grow. So they are estrogens. The difference, as Dr. Davis said, is that they are metabolized faster. And this has to do with one thing called coevolution. We have lived with plants for a very long time now, millions and millions of years, and therefore it seems that we have developed means to detoxify those estrogens, do something with them that won't affect us as much. So basically, all estrogens are estrogens, that could be said, but some estrogens are metabolized faster and therefore won't make as much harm than others that last forever.
And I would add some of them are actually good for you because the soy product appears to be an antioxidant that can be beneficial and is being tested, by the way, now at the National Cancer Institute as an anti-cancer treatment and as a preventive agent, as is some of the constituents of broccoli. So we need to, it's a very complex set of information we're providing to you, and I think the bottom line is that you have to keep generating the support for some of the issues that this lady and others of you have indicated are important, which is that we want to keep our children healthier, we want to keep people from getting cancer in the first place, and we want to move forward with the scientific information that we need to achieve that result. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's give a really big hand for our two scientists, Dr. Soto and Dr. Davis. I think that they have made it perfectly clear to us that responsible scientists are out there doing their job. They've done their job and they're continuing to do their job, and that it is now our responsibility to see that this science comes to the forefront and is properly used and proper sound decisions are made that are going to have a preventative effect on the development of cancers and other problems on all of us. Now, we've got a lot of really great speakers lined up today. We've brought in people who really have knowledge, and we want to share these people with you. We want you to get the greatest benefit out of these people. We're running behind. So I'm going to ask a little patience on your part and cooperation. I know you've been sitting here for a while and you need to get up. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, folks, and I want you back in here for the next group. And listen, we're going to be a little short on dinner time, but we want to hear what people have to say. And we're going to have to learn to get out there, grab that cup of coffee or juice or muffin or whatever, get back in here and move on with the next speaker. So 5 minutes, folks. Thanks. 5. Convincing those people who are in control and who have responsibility for this state to see that this state is on a sound course. We have a few people in this state, a few legislators, a few appointees who accept their responsibilities seriously and who have the understanding and the knowledge to really try to put us on the right course. We're fortunate to have this morning one such person here who's been in the forefront in the legislature, and that is Representative Quasar. Ms. Quasar, will you please come and say just a word or two for us?
Good morning. My name is Roy Kazan Jr., State Representative of District 58. You can't hear me? Am I on? Can you hear me now? No.
hit it, please. Florence, can you hit it? Hit it, Florence.
Good morning. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, good, good. For a little while. My name is Roy Kazir, Jr., State Representative of District 58, which encompasses what is known as the river parishes between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. I live in Donaldsonville, lifelong resident there. The legislative district encompasses major portions of Iberville, Ascension, Assumption, St. James, and St. John the Baptist parishes, respectively. I have one of the largest reapportioned House districts in the state of Louisiana. I have about a little over 112, 115 miles of physical territory from the northern end to the southern end. So a lot of my folks on the northern end of the district relate to and gravitate to Baton Rouge, and those individuals of my constituents and citizens on the southern end gravitate towards New Orleans. So I'm right there in the middle, trying to do a balancing act. But thank you all very much for giving me just a few minutes of your time. I bring you greetings from the House of Representatives, and most particularly my colleagues who stand side by side with me, fighting for the protection of the environment and all of the citizens that have to put up with what we're putting up with in this state, especially in the corridor known as quote-unquote Cancer Alley. I want to thank Dr. Robinson for giving me a few minutes and introducing me and the rest of the panelists this morning. I just stopped by to share briefly with you a few of my comments and insight as to what I see the problem has been there and presently is at the state capitol in Louisiana. First of all, foremost, I think that we need to sensitize the legislature. Their state government is so vast. I know as a freshman 4 years ago, when I took that oath of office, I thought that I knew it all. But reality set in. And we more or less have to become generalists, try to know a little about everything. But it is so vast, there's no way you can have the expert knowledge in all of the fields. Goodness for support groups and individuals like you all that come or inform or call us in messages and give us some guidance as to what your feelings are and which direction we should go. Naturally, being there in the 58th district, I have one of the highest proliferations of chemical industries as compared to anywhere else in this state. Growing up there in Donaldsonville, I certainly remember as a child growing up with the fruit trees being abundant in the backyards of everybody's houses and the hummingbirds sucking the honeysuckles on the honeysuckle vines and all of those things, and wildlife was very, very abundant. Today, as we raise our children, my wife and I, those things don't exist on a large scale anyway. But we, as a legislature, we as representatives and senators, representing the best interest, the interests of the majority of the folks, must become sensitized to what is actually taking place. Now, not a scientist, a far cry from that. My degree is in business administration, and I'm the executive director of Parks and Recreation for Ascension Parish. But having all of those plants there and seeing some of the tactics that have been used and looking at some of my colleagues falling prey to the influences of the Louisiana Chemical Association and other conglomerates is somewhat embarrassing. 2 years ago, we tried to run, my colleague and I, State Representative Melvin Kip Holden, we came forward with a hazardous waste tax, a bill that would have taxed those industries that produce and handle hazardous waste. And let me tell you something, we could not get it out. We could not get it out at all. My estimation, it would have curtailed the production of hazardous waste. It certainly would have prevented the importation of hazardous waste, and the revenues that we would have generated from that tax alone would have helped clean up some of the abandoned waste sites, which are running abundantly here in the state of Louisiana. Though that measure failed. But we are constantly, the few of us that's banding together, we're doing our very best to educate and inform our colleagues as to how they should feel or what direction they should be headed in when it comes to protecting the environment and the people that live within it. One of my campaign platforms was that of the environment. And today I still feel the same way as I did 4 years ago when I ran for the office, that when we're talking about the environment, we must treat it for exactly what it is. The only one we got. The only one we've got. We cannot go out in space and lasso one, rope it, tie it in, and bring it into this, into our area. We must protect the environment. I am very embarrassed as a legislator to see that Louisiana is still #1 when according to the TRI, toxic release inventory. That's nothing to be proud of whatsoever. As long as our air is questioned, the water we drink, the water that we bathe ourselves and prepare our foods in, and must use as a life source, and the land that has been injected with chemicals, we just can't give up the struggle. Now, I saw the shooting from the hip yesterday. We had a panel discussion where we received a lot of great testimony, and it was a pleasure being there, participating in that. But it must, as you all know, I'm sure, it must start on the local level. The people that you put in office is the difference that actually makes a difference. We cannot have individuals that will fall prey because of money contributions to campaigns and things of that nature, the power and influence. We can't have those individuals represent us. So please stand tall and stay strong and don't give up. Don't give up. Give us the microphone and we will continue to fight. And slowly but surely we are gaining some more sensitive ears. But again, anything that I can do to assist you all, please don't hesitate to call upon me. Dr. Florence Robinson and I are very good friends, and I lean on her for information because I know she has the expertise. This past February, I had an opportunity to go on public radio with the Wisconsin Public Radio Network, which aired in three states, Illinois, Wisconsin, and I think Michigan, from my legislative office in Donaldsonville. We talked about environmental injustices and environmental racism. And I'm sure you all understand and know that if you look at this, the data and the statistics, that these industries are located in either majority minority communities and or economically underprivileged communities. Those individuals, those folks that have not had a voice to stand up to say that we don't want this in our community. Presently, we are fighting in Ascension Parish, in Kansas City Southern, who services several of the chemical plants out there in my area. They're trying to build a railroad spur to bring in and transport more hazardous materials and chemicals. That's a no-no. We have drafted a resolution which was verified. We got it passed in this last legislative session to the ICS saying that we don't want this in our community. Enough is enough. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's the Chemical Association and all of their special interests who's saying that it won't be that bad. All of those folks, none of them live in a district or in a residential area where that railroad spur will come through. Cancer is very serious, as you know. Unfortunately, on yesterday, we funeralized one of my friends that was a victim of cancer. And, excuse me, we just have to keep the fight up, y'all. Don't give up. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and stay with us, and may God bless and keep each and every one of you.
Thank you very much, Representative Quasar. We depend on you, but we'll be back knocking on your door, asking for you, and looking for you to do great things for us, and we'll be behind you, too. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce our next 3 speakers, and I'm going to ask them then to follow through in that sequence. Our first speaker will be Ms. Diane Dillon Ridgely of the Women's Environment and Development Organization. Ms. Ridgely is a human rights activist, is a consultant on international and domestic development issues. particularly pertaining to women. In 1992, she was elected by the White House to serve as an advisor to and member of the United States delegation to the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, that is the Earth Summit, in Rio in June of 1992. As a national board member of the YWCA of the United States, she represented that body of the World Women's Congress for a Healthy Planet in November of 1991. She was also on the United States delegation during the 4th preparatory meeting of, what is this, UNCED, UNCED? That's it. March of 1992. In 1994, President Clinton appointed her to his President's Council on Sustainable Development. Also in 1994, she was elected president of Zero Population Growth. Diane, a state-certified mediator in Iowa with the Iowa Mediation Service, specializes in agricultural mediation and public policy negotiation. She is co-chair of Racial Justice for the YWCA and has been chair of the Targeted Small Business Board for the Iowa Department of Economic Development since 1987. She is the immediate past president of the Association of Iowa Human Rights Agencies, having focused on hate crimes and sexual harassment during her 4-year tenure. Since the Earth Summit, Diane has served as national co-chair of the Citizens Network for Sustainable Development. Her public policy work focuses on conflict resolution and community development. She did her undergraduate work at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and is both senior consultant for WeDo, the Women's Environmental and Development Organization in New York City, and an associate of the Kettering Foundation in Dayton, Ohio. Ms. Ridgely, hold your hand up so people know you. Oh, hello. Our next speaker is a cancer survivor. She is Joyce Washington Ivory. Ms. Ivory, will you raise your hand, please? Ms. Ivory is the founder of the Edna B. and Joyce Faye Washington Breast Cancer Foundation. She's a native of New Orleans, has lived here all of her life, and through this foundation now is providing services for women in the New Orleans area who have suffered cancer. And Ms. Ivory is going to share with us some of her experiences as a breast cancer survivor. Our third speaker is Monica Jones. Monica Jones is here representing the Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice, a very, very old organization. Those of you who were here yesterday heard Connie Tucker, who's the executive director of this organization, tell you some of the history of the Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice, commonly known as SOC. SOC is an organization that has taken a real leadership role in the area of environmental justice. It's located in Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, it has gone to battle over and over and over again with Region 4, especially Region 4 EPA, representing small, polluted communities in the Southeast. And Monica is their staff writer and community service coordinator. And without any further ado, ladies, would you please follow in this order? Thank you very much.
Thank you and good morning. Is this volume level okay?
You still get close to the microphone.
A little closer to the microphone. Is this better? No. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for putting this together and for inviting me to come here. As some of you may have heard during our testimony, many of us were together 2 weeks ago in North Carolina at a similar meeting. And at some point, I almost feel like we're all going to be able to deliver each other's speeches. But the important part is I really want people to think of today's presentations not as isolated speeches, but I want you to really listen to these in their connected fashion. Because many of us are building upon what others have said as we change the order. Like Judy's nodding, and I know part of what Judy is going to address later on today will specifically focus on corporate responsibility or irresponsibility in much of this process. So don't think of what Jay is going to say, so don't think of our presentations in isolation. I won't speak much about pesticides because I know he's going to talk a lot about pesticides. I won't have to talk a lot about some of the scientific pieces, but we heard those earlier. But what they did is they laid the groundwork for us to think of what's next in terms of the political aspect. And I'm going to repeat several things several times because they are so critical. The first one being early detection is not prevention. I want everybody to really grapple and understand that. Early detection Prevention is important. You need to find out as soon as possible, but it is not prevention. Prevention is not being subjected to or having the conditions that cause you to come up with cancer. So however early you may discover that you have it or not, that is not prevention. I really want people not to have any ambiguity on that point. I also want to repeat just a teeny bit of what I said yesterday, and it's on specifically environmental justice requires us to see a just, equitable, sustainable, safe, and healthy world. This is central to a democracy. And one of the things that we are doing is we're seeing the combining of a number of different movements. Whether one comes at this issue from the women's movement, or from the environmental justice movement, or from the civil rights movement, or from the progressive movement in terms of agricultural reform, reforming or revamping what we do about industrial production, we're seeing the convergence of all of those pieces. This is not a social agenda or a scientific agenda or it is a broader agenda that brings together the attempt for us as a people in this country in the 21st century to make the promises of democracy. You remember that Constitution and all that wonderful language that had room for all of us? Or I remember during the bicentennial in 1987, someone asked me to write a piece about the Constitution. And they said, you know, the Constitution is just the best thing that's ever been written. And I thought, well, let me think about what Thurgood Marshall's comment was on it at the time. And I thought it was interesting that President Clinton this week, when he made his speech on affirmative action, drew on that same quote of Thurgood Marshall's. It said, the Constitution is good, had nice words, and if you add to it the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments that occurred over the last 200 years, a significant body of legal casework that has gone forward in that time period, you know, we may actually begin to get it right at some point. You know, I think about the fact that until there was women's suffrage, as an African American and as a female, I didn't show up in the Constitution at all until the 1920s. I mean, you know, that design didn't have me in it at all, you know, for an awfully long time. And when people, as they often do, say, you know, uh-oh, Diane's going to talk about race again. And yes, we are going to talk about race. Said, you know, well, you know, slavery was a long time ago. I remind people, we tend to think of things from the perspective of our individual lives. You know, we in this country have not been post-emancipation as long as there was slavery in this country. And that kind of deeply rooted social restructuring has a long-term impact over people. So, you know, when people tell you, you know, slavery's over, you say, well, you know, there is legal emancipation, but we're going to deal with and talking about a number of things that are happening in different communities. The reality of we'll see how much it's over or not. Where is she? Sister Eula Malone, where is she? There she is. When she spoke yesterday during the hearings, she was very powerful, spoke from tremendous passion and the hurt of someone who is faced with and living in a very real situation. I had already planned to start my presentation today talking about what went on, well, what is still going on or trying to go on in Homer, Louisiana. And I just want to add a couple of points of specifics to what she gave to you, which was a very powerful presentation. When Senator Bennett Johnson stood on the steps of the courthouse in June of 1989 and announced great pride, flags waving on the square and everything, that LES, which is the Louisiana Energy Services plant, would be there, you know, what that plant is going to do is to convert uranium into fuel for nuclear reactors. It promises, quote, to boost the local economy. At best, 180 permanent jobs. And if one just looks at the educational level in that community, I think the calculation is that maybe 2 of those jobs can go to people who live in that community. So, you know, whenever people start talking about the economic benefits, I find it interesting that all of the economic benefits go to one set of people, and all of the risk goes to another set of people who have to live with that. And that distribution is totally unacceptable. Now, that particular plant will have, I think the numbers are proposed for it to be $750 million of uranium enrichment is slated for construction in the middle of Forest Grove and Center Springs. It is critical to note that this is an unincorporated community. This is one of the legal reasons why it was chosen, targeted, focused. You know, at some point, when you listen to people keep saying, well, it's just coincidental. You know, well, there's a wonderful woman who met with us in February, us being the group that came together in February of '94 in Austin, Texas, to begin to plan this national campaign on the issues of breast cancer in women. Her name is Lynn Bow. She lives in Birmingham, Alabama. And do you remember that night when Lynn said to us, she called up Browning Ferris Industries, because she had just been hit with a personal slap suit of $8 million from BFI. And she said, I would like for you to give me a list of all of your transfer, hazardous waste sites, and permanent sites that are located in middle class or higher white communities. She said, now if you need a little longer to give me the answer to that question, I can hold. But I have a feeling that you can answer that question rather quickly, because that is a class of 0. So at some point, all this coincidence just doesn't wash, right? Okay. Now, among the other things that Senator Johnson didn't mention is that this plant would generate 4,200 tons of radioactive uranium waste each year, which would be buried, quote, quote, less than 1 mile from the front doors of many of the people who live in that community. You know, at some point, how long do you let this madness go on? Well, we see the people in that community are saying no longer, no more, not us. The disproportionate subjugation of people of color to toxins through their land, their air, and their water, this environmental racism, it's funny, I was almost willing to say maybe we've gone past the point of calling it environmental racism. Then you listen to somebody, or you talk to no, still environmental racism. Often it's carried out in the name of profit, progress, or public good. And so I just repeat, that distribution factor, when people start talking about your progress and your public good, say, well, honey, until you give me some of that public money, which is not public money, it's private money, but it is public exploitation. And so one of the things that we really have to do in this whole process is change the very basic or ethic on which we function and do industrial production. We really must do that. Okay. And to speak briefly to that, and Connie Tucker did for people who didn't hear her during the testimony yesterday, she mentioned the seminal meeting that really galvanized much of these efforts and made them connected, particularly between the African American, Hispanic and Latino, the Native American, and the Asian American communities in this country, which was the National People of Color Summit on environmental leadership, which was held in Washington, D.C. in 1991 in October. And there were 650 grassroots people who were part of that meeting. And one of the products of that meeting is here somewhere on this table with me, are the principles of environmental justice. And I have a list of those. Time won't allow me to go through them. But if Mary Lee doesn't have them, or if the organizers don't have them, we can have copies made. I only have to have one that I carry with me always, that we can see. This would be a good, excellent prescription for people to live by, and industry to live by, and governments to live by in this country and others, because it is by design a way of functioning for around the world. Because there is an intimate link between what is happening to poor and marginalized communities in the United States and poor and marginalized communities in the world. I say Birmingham and Bhopal in India are exactly the same situation. And we are strengthened and empowered when we realize that we have allies all around the world. Because what we see is the 21st century version of colonialism and imperialism, which is happening in our communities, but all the profits are going to someplace else. It's a very old story, isn't it? Okay, and as Pat, who I see standing in the back, right? Yeah, mentioned yesterday, in New Orleans, for example, their federally sponsored low-income housing was built over one landfill in 1969 and another in 1977. And the EPA is currently considering relocating or relocation efforts for those people. I should tell you that I used to work at the Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, it was my first job after undergraduate school. I started as a student intern. And it was interesting because Howard, in case anybody in this room doesn't know, is a predominantly black institution. And I remember when I went back up on campus and people said to me, well, why are you working on this environmental stuff? You know, why are you working on these white issues? Now, this is 1972. And I said, well, you know, I have been known to eagles and snail darters, because that's how the literature and the language and the Big Ten so-called environmental organizations of the day characterized environment. And we, particularly in poor and marginalized and people of color communities, have been crippled by a lack of that language which came from the academic community of conservation and leisure. I mean, you go back to Teddy Roosevelt and you go back to the early establishment of park systems in this country, and they are beautiful, and believe me, they are yours, just like they belong to the folks who belong to the Sierra Club and everywhere else. But the language didn't facilitate that. And so the language kept us separated far longer. And what the environmental justice movement particularly has done is to galvanize the joining and connecting of those issues. I'm originally from Dallas, Texas. And for 30-some years in West Dallas, there was an elementary school that was right here. There was a lead smelter that was right here. And the playground of that elementary school, which was a loose dust material, it wasn't even asphalt. That smelter functioned every day. And that loose dust on that playground, kids, 5 days a week, 8 or more hours a day, were in that school with the windows open. And now that particular school was almost exclusively black. And when, quote, the early integration occurred, it had Hispanics in there as well. Now, you tell me, what happens to the capacity of those children who went through that school for 6, 7, 8 years of their lives, and daily, for 8 or more hours, were exposed to this lead production? And then you find someone like Charles Murray who comes along and makes an assessment of IQ and says we are genetically inferior. Oh no, it depends on when you come into the process and how much you ignore of what the environmental impact is of what's happened. That's a whole different set of dynamics. But that's also a different speech. So we must look at race and class in the United States, because the most polluted communities are inner city and rural areas characterized by abandoned and neglected housing, high rates of poverty, chronic unemployment, inefficient health systems, decreasing rates on capital investment. Now, let's just take Los Angeles as a microcosm of the country. 71% of the African Americans and 50% of the Latinos in Los Angeles live in areas with more polluted air, while 34% of the whites in Los Angeles do. Nationally, 60% of both African Americans and Latino people live in communities with one or more uncontrolled waste sites, and that's from the 1971 study by Imani and Chavis. Cheap real estate has been used as the argument for why the sightings were always in those communities, but I have a comment to make on that in just a second. Emile, Alabama, 80% of the people who live there in the largest U.S. toxic waste dump site are black. So 80% of the population there is black, and that is the single largest toxic waste dump. Columbia, Mississippi, where you find the Jesus People Against Pollution, are battling some of the most highly toxic environments. 20 years ago, there was a significant dumping of benzene and other chemicals were first buried there. Unfortunately, this is a long list. For time, I will not continue to read it, though. So environmental degradation and the marginalization of people of color are linked. We must begin to challenge the power relations that are saying, and say loudly in absolutely no uncertain terms, that we will no longer collude in a system which is responsible for our oppression and marginalization. Grassroots environmentalists are no longer supporting the poisoning of their mother and our communities in the name of interest and profits to someone else. And we will no longer be the unrealized subsidy for industry. Our health and our bodies have been both, and for too long, offered up with no recognition, no compensatory pay, and usually only a bad outcome at the end of that. We will no longer silently and willingly participate in our own oppression. We must end an economic structure and production patterns which have never recognized or acknowledged its dependence on either the natural heritage or the exploitation of our health in order to produce their profits, and that is an unacceptable level of risk. Somebody starts talking to you about risk assessment, say, my body, my children's body, my family, our relatives' health, that is an unacceptable risk. It is totally unacceptable. The issue of class should never by these marginalized communities or sectors in the social structure. And we stated that simply no more. Now, it's interesting because Kenneth Oldman, who's the director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences in North Carolina, takes issue with this portrayal as being somehow specifically racially targeted. He said, well, it's my impression that poverty plays a greater role than race. Not that it really matters, but it is. Oldham says, he agrees, however, that blacks are disproportionately affected because they have lower average incomes. Oh, gee, thanks. Okay. Now, if you also look at some of the track records of the institutions that are set out as our, quote, protectors, they don't do too well either, do they? The penalties against polluters remain 500% greater when they involve white areas compared to when they involve black areas. And I should tell you that my statistics are black and white because the statistics have not been done in terms of Hispanic and Latino communities and Native American communities. And when you start looking at the statistics and the systematic targeting of Indian reservations, Native American reservations in this country, it is a crime of tears that compares to the systematic robbing people of their land in the first place from the last century. Race alone, not income, puts a community at risk. That is sufficient because they found that even, quote, middle and higher income blacks who lived in communities, still, race was the single predicting factor who was going to live nearest the worst polluting conditions. The environmental, and that's Bunyan Bryant from the University of Michigan. The Environmental Protection Agency opts for permanent treatment of toxic waste in white areas. But waste containment, a far less effective option, is the rule in communities of people of color. The number, I actually don't like the term minorities because this is the way someone else wrote it up. I think that's a negative and a pejorative. So the number of, quote, minorities who live in areas blighted by toxic waste has actually grown in the last 25 years, not diminished. So we're even on the wrong track even if you allow that the institutions meant to do the right thing. I said I wasn't going to talk about pesticides much, but you can't ignore these other factors that are participating in this process. For example, in 1955, we produced in the world 400 tons of pesticides in the world. And a conservative estimate for 1985 is that 3 million tons of pesticides were produced. And that particular piece we got from Margarita Arias, who is one of the co-chairs, international co-chairs of WeDo, and that was part of her presentation when we launched the international aspect of this campaign in Cairo in September of last year. So we have to remember constantly that issues of agricultural production and exposure are major to this. Florence mentioned that I'm president of Zero Population Growth, and people of color in particular have not been particularly active or participating in decisions about population issues. But we certainly have been subject to the results of the decisions that have been made by demographers and others on those issues. So it's important for us to understand those connections as well. Okay, I had divided my presentation into two basic parts, and I had a piece on what I think are the three transformation aspects that we need to consider at this time, and I'm really trying to condense because I know actually some people may want to eat lunch. But they're at any level of development, because we really have to look at a transformation of development. We are experiencing three interlocking crises in our world today which threaten all people of the world, rich and poor, educated, uneducated, and north and south, and I mean that in an international sense of north and south, although sometimes it seems to fit inside the country too. The first is poverty, the second is environmental stress, and the third is communal violence, and we really must think of these as connected. At any level of development, increased population, energy use, and resource consumption add to development complications and environmental stress. We need to examine this concept of development as transformation of our values, our economic theory, and our willingness to work for change consistent with today's ecological and social realities. This transformation must address basic needs of global society, and there are three pieces that I propose to that. The first is justice. The second is sustainability, which many of us agree is a term that has not been completely clarified. And the third is inclusiveness, which is essential to the issues of gender and race. Justice, such a severe imbalance between over and under consumers of the world's resources simply cannot continue. Justice requires that people have the means and the opportunity to produce a minimum decent livelihood for themselves and their families. It rejects the right of one person or country to self-enrichment based on the appropriation of the resources of which another person's or country's very survival depends. Sustainability requires that each generation recognize its obligation for stewardship of the Earth's natural resources and ecosystem on behalf of future generations. And thirdly, inclusiveness, because a lack of inclusiveness or the ability of persons to participate in the decisions which affect their lives breeds alienation and social conflict. This is particularly true in terms of the issues relating to women, people of color, and children. We see development as a profound, fundamental rethinking of the assumptions which have shaped our world and all of us in it. We need to understand the scope and seriousness of the problems, how they affect women and children, how they affect people in the South and in the North. In fact, what we seek to redefine for our priorities, how we build not some new world order, that was the term we were banting about, but rather a new world community. We can talk about a world economic crisis, energy crisis, an environmental crisis, or a development crisis. They're not separate. We cannot solve them one at a time, and they are intertwined and interlocked. They are all one situation. They constitute a global set of circumstances that must be understood as chronic and systemic to the way much of the industrialized world has approached the use of natural resources, of equity towards people in the newly developing sectors of the world, whether in the so-called first world and third world. I don't like that term either. In fact, I often use the term two-thirds world because there are a whole lot more of us that are in it. Now, we have had many people who have historically given us very wise words and thoughts about what we need to do. Yesterday, I quoted from Rachel Carson, which was for me personally, as well as my grandmothers, both of them, who were personal heroes of my life, who have told us very early on what we needed to know and what we needed to do, or if we had followed them. We have examples in this country. If we had listened to Du Bois, if we had listened to Tocqueville, we had listened to people over a century ago who told us what we needed to do to address, to really make this country equitable. We don't do that. We have a bad track record on that. Now, I want to read something to you from, I just broke my glasses. I want to read something to you from a speech that Robert Kennedy made in 1968, a few months before he was killed, when he was first starting to run for president. And he said, "We will find neither national purpose nor personal satisfaction in a mere continuation of economic progress, in an endless amassing of worldly goods. We cannot measure national spirit by the Dow Jones average, nor national achievement by the gross domestic product. For the gross domestic product includes air pollution and advertising for cigarettes and ambulances which clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and jails for the people who break them. The gross national product includes the destruction of the redwoods and the death of Lake Superior. It grows with the production of napalm and missiles and nuclear warheads. It includes Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the broadcasting of television programs which glorify violence to sell goods to our children. And if the gross national product includes all this, there is much that it does not comprehend. It does not allow for the health of our families, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It is indifferent to the decency of our factories and the safety of our streets alike. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or of our public debate or the integrity of our public officials. The gross national product measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except whether we are proud to be Americans. 1968. Now, what have we done about that? And when someone like Newt Gingrich says, I take it personally, to me, that there was nothing in the 1960s that was of value for us to emulate, I want him to understand that it was Fannie Lou Hamer and words like this from Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, people that I call my person, who said what we needed to do as a country. So he's wrong, yet again. Now, for the last part of what I wanted to talk about specifically was, and I mentioned this yesterday, just briefly, some of the studies that have come out that are looking at specifically what is different and what is happening to the issue of breast cancer, specifically for black women. Because while white women are still more likely to get breast cancer, black women are far more likely to die from it. And only now are few people beginning to ask why. I don't think it's coincidental that some of the reasons that some of the people are asking why is that there are indeed more African Americans who are physicians and clinicians who are conducting some of that research. That's not exclusively the answer, but that helps. As Randall Robinson from Trans Africa always says, nothing beats presence in the room, especially when they're doing the dollars and policy. Now, breast cancer appears to be in a more deadly form among some black women, and the tumors tend to be, quote, more malignant as measured by cellular indicators, and this is a negative prognosis. It has become evident that high breast cancer death rates among black women are not exclusively the result of poverty, the lack of access to medical care, or some assumed unwillingness to use medical services. I think it's critical to highlight this, because when the first knee-jerk response when looking at these differences in rates was to say, well, what are the sociological factors that are responsible? Which ignores the fact that there may be something very different about the tumors. Now, Dr. Brenda K. Edwards, who's Associate Director of a surveillance program at the National Cancer Institute, said, we can't ignore these differences, and the jury is still out on whether or not these indicate if we should use a different kind of more aggressive treatment, or the conclusion is also out on the effectiveness of screening, because one of the things we found, in general, the literature suggests that there's a 7 to 9 year latency period in terms of the time that breast cancer will develop before the tumors in particular are palpable. But we are seeing tumors in black women that seem to have 1 year as a timeline. So even if you dutifully got your mammogram before the next year was up, you still might have a palpable tumor. And people are saying when black women in particular come into their doctors, especially premenopausal black women, you're not right. And that when you were talking about yesterday, when you were listing bringing sanity to a situation, I was thinking when we look at what people tell us, when people tell women about breast cancer, it's all the stuff that you did wrong. In other words, you either didn't have children, or you had them too soon, or you had too many of them. You either did nurse them or didn't nurse them. You either have too much fat in your diet, you either didn't exercise enough, or you exercise so much that you no longer have your menses, which is throwing the rest of your hormone system off. I mean, the list is long, but you can rest assured whatever went wrong was something that you did or didn't do. Well, even the most conservative researchers, and you've heard during the course of these last 2 days and in much of the literature, that 30%, that can at best count for about 30% of the cancers. Now, in any other field, as a teacher, when you have 70% of the time somebody's not passing something, most people don't consider that real successful as a rate. Most people would go back and say, well, now, if we only know what does this 30% of the time, what's going on the other 7? Isn't that a real logical question to ask? But it's amazing the resistance with which that question has been addressed. I know I'm rushing. Doctors Richard Elledge and Kent Osborne, who are colleagues at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio, examined more than 6,000 tumors that were sent to them from all over the United States. They found that the tumors of black women had more actively dividing cells than those from white women, and the tumors lacked hormone receptors again, which is again a poor prognosis for outcome. Dr. Vivian W. Chin of the Louisiana State Medical Center and colleagues examined 963 newly diagnosed tumors and found that those tumors from black women were more likely to have histological features, again associated with poor prognosis, including the features found by Dr. Elledge and his colleagues. A third study by Dr. Robert S. Siegel of the George Washington University Medical Center in Washington, D.C., examined laboratory data on 708 tumors from women treated there and found that the tumors from black women were, again, more likely and more actively growing and less likely to have the hormone receptors and appeared to be more deranged. Now, as I said, people immediately began to look for sociological Edwards study, you remember I mentioned her earlier, said you can account for maybe approximately 1/2 of the increase in the death rates for blacks by looking at it. So 1,222 women in Atlanta, New Orleans, San Francisco, and Oakland were part of the study. And the substantial proportion of increase in mortality resulted from biological differences in their cancers, not some sociological factors. There was a Dr. Siegel who did a study that looked at the subset of women who were members of HMOs, where they were black and white members, and they each had equal access to the same services, to mammograms and medical care. Even so, inside the HMOs, the women tended to have larger, more advanced tumors when they were diagnosed, and they went back and tracked how those women used the services, and they were approximately comparable. So, Dr. Edwards said blacks have in general waited no longer than whites did, and did you hear me? Black women waited in general no longer than white women did to go seek treatment. So we need to debunk those myths that again blame us for why our cancers are different or our outcomes are different. There was very little difference, and it confirmed this widespread suspicion among doctors that black people really do not, that black people really do seem to have more intransient cancers. Just as a teeny anecdote, my other grandfather practiced medicine in Dallas, Texas, starting in 1917. And he, in his notebooks and his literature, began to note that around the 1930s, he began to see a difference, specifically with the incidence of fibroids in black women and some other factors. And I see a number of women shaking their heads. The other thing is that he said women did not, and I'm not trying to be a physician, and I'm not trying to make a prescription at all, but he said one need not immediately respond by having surgery, but one should have very aggressive monitoring when these aberrations occur. And that's the kind of treatment that black women in many instances have not been able to receive or to afford. I just wanted to conclude with a sense that much of the medical community, some perhaps drag kicking and screaming, but some perhaps more open and willing, has come to realize that there really are some differences out there. And this, again, brings us back to the point of the politics in this situation.